Hi everyone, it's Dr. RAMANI and welcome back to this YouTube channel that takes on all kinds of issues related to difficult and narcissistic relationships. It's my hope that by getting this understanding, you'll be able to navigate these situations better yourself. There's a theme that often comes up in relationships with narcissistic individuals is that people are almost they're almost in sway and moderately, not necessarily even in awe of the person who's narcissistic, but they're committed to, like, I'm going to figure this out. I'm going to figure out the workaround. In essence, they're going to figure out how to almost master or figure out the narcissist. It's a dangerous game to play. Let's talk a little bit about why it's so risky. So let's talk about these risks, as it were, of somebody saying, I'm going to be the narcissist whisperer. I'm going to master the narcissist. Because I'm going to tell you now, not even I claim to be able to do that. And I work with people like this a lot. Anyone who has read Pete Walker's work on traumatic responses, especially as they relate to complex post-traumatic stress disorder, may be familiar with his fourth F of the sympathetic nervous system response. Most of us are familiar with fight, flight, or freeze. Walker raises a fourth F of fawn. And it is such an important issue because the fawning response is something that raises shame in survivors. That idea of fawning is like, almost like, oh, yeah, sure, and I'm so interested in you, and ooh, and I'm eyeing. That reaction that opposite comes naturally does raise shame in people who've been through these relationships. How could I have fawned over someone like this? And yet that fawning is often a natural part of the nervous system response to these kinds of relationships. If you haven't read Walker's work, I recommend that you give it a look, as he has some important insights into these kinds of trauma responses and how they may present in relationships. By reading that, you may understand that there's a range of sort of traumatic kind of sympathetic responses we have to these relationships. When we fawn over someone, we flatter them, we obey them, we ooh and ah over them. In essence, we deliver high-grade narcissistic supply. Walker and others who study trauma would argue that this fawning response is a safety behavior for a child who was exposed to verbal or physical abuse or even abandonment, which would make sense because the fawning may draw the abandoning or invalidating parent or caregiver closer, right? They're fawning over the parent, and some of you may have experienced this. You fawned over your parent to keep them from always pulling away, and that would then, in the child's mind, ensure safety. But even in adults who are in invalidating or narcissistic relationships, the fawning may create safety, or the perception of safety, the hope or the idea that the narcissist will not leave, or will not rage, or will not gaslight. Fawning may actually give the survivor a little sense of control in the situation for a moment. Pete Walker argues that the fawning response is automatic. It's not something that someone's thinking about. It's not intentional, nor is it manipulative, but rather that fawning response creates safety. So it's reflexive, just like the fighting, the freezing, or the flighting is just one more part of this sympathetic nervous system response. Now, all of this, these ideas of fawning and all of that, all of this runs into another larger theme. Lots of people out there that are listening to or watching this content or reading content, and the world of narcissism content is growing exponentially. And not all of it is consistent. One thing that many people want to know about is how to make it a relationship work with a narcissistic person, whether it's a close relationship, family relationship, or better yet, even quite a few people want to know how to outplay the narcissist. Now, people in marriages that they do not want to leave, or in workplace situations that they don't want to quit and that they want to make work, don't want to know just how to endure and survive these relationships, but they actually want to know how to master the narcissist. And the belief and hope that it can be done, that it's possible to master the narcissist, can leave people trying to do this, to try to master them. But trying to master the narcissistic person goes much deeper than that. For some adults, it's part of an ongoing fawning process. The automatic response that they have, and this sort of sense, maybe, that they have to win this difficult person over, no different than a child sitting at the tense childhood dinner table, tense about whether their parent is going to blow up, and fawning over that parent simply to maintain safety. It becomes a reflexive response then. This fawning response can become a reflexive response to a wide range of narcissistic people in adulthood. For a substantial proportion of people, when they meet a person who is a little bit or a lot of bit grandiose, entitled, charming, or charismatic, the fawn response kicks in, along sometimes with some freeze response too. Instead of seeing red flags in these initial encounters with a narcissistic person and politely excusing themselves from that interaction, and ideally never returning to the conversation, a person sort of meeting a new narcissist, especially if they're fawning, they may actually double down on trying to win the narcissistic person over. And if they succeed at that and maintain a relationship with this person, and not succeed at winning, but actually succeed at getting them to notice for a minute, and as the relationship proceeds, a person may find themselves no different than the child at the dinner table, trying to win over a parent by sharing tales of perfect test scores, or a home run that the child might have hit, or an award that you might have received during a school assembly. I have watched over and over again adults try to win over the narcissist who's right in front of them, trying to keep up with the proverbial Joneses, and may even exaggerate themselves, maybe, almost grandiose up themselves to keep the narcissistic person as a friend, as an acquaintance, or as a possible partner. This can really set a toxic precedent in which the relationship, in essence, becomes a fawn fest, in which you keep trying to find a way to master the narcissist, to figure them out, to win them over, to keep them around, and perhaps to validate ourselves, with the faulty and rather sad presumption that if the narcissistic person we are with is somehow impressed by us and doesn't leave, well, that validates us and also sets up the behavioral cycle of continually trying to fawn over the narcissistic person so you can keep them around, even while a part of your mind recognizes how toxic that this relationship is. That sort of fawning need for mastery can keep sort of also winning over. In so many cases, the slightly rejecting, remote, distant, supercilious, judgy exterior of the narcissistic person plays into every hard-wired part of a person who endured narcissistic or invalidating childhoods, as well as that foundation that got set then of fawning, and then working through the fantasy of winning over the narcissist can be played out. Because that's what it is. The working through of the childhood conflict. As a child, you could not win over that absent, distracted, disinterested, unimpressed, or invalidating parent. So in adulthood, you play that conflict out with people like your parent or your partner, and keep attempting, or other people you work with or friends, and you keep attempting to master the narcissist around you. And this may not just be with partners, but as I said, with friends, with bosses, with other acquaintances. And people will say they put so much energy into trying to master the narcissistic people in their midst, they actually don't put the proper amount of energy into the healthy relationships in their midst. Narcissistic relationships by nature are competitive. You are, in many ways, competing with the narcissist. You are competing to win the affection, attention, or favor of the narcissist. You are competing with other people to get the narcissist's attention. So these relationships constantly feel like an uphill climb, and an uphill fight. Narcissistic individuals, especially very powerful narcissistic individuals, will wield their power, and like a 10-year-old who will be sort of joyfully picking who will and who won't be on their team, may sort of delight in that sadistic power of making people wait and wonder when they will be picked. There is also a subjugation of the self that happens in these relationships, meaning that we have to push our authentic selves down in order to stay in toxic relationships. And pushing our authentic selves down is also a part of attempting to master the narcissistic person. It really is tragic because the belief is that our real selves are not good enough for the narcissistic people around us, and that we have to create a false self to win the narcissistic person over or to remain in the relationship. Listen, any of you watching who as a child may have taken on a hobby or an activity or a sport or an interest to please a parent knows what that is about. And let's face it, it rarely worked. Even if you're good at it, they'd still be distracted. But that subjugation, especially over many years, means that we start losing touch with our real real selves. And when the day comes that you finally extricate yourself from these narcissistic relationships, you may find it difficult to relocate your real self and find your real self and strike out on an important journey of identity finding and identity building. Remember, your fawning, as it were, your attempt to master them, is feeding their narcissistic supply. And the harder you try, the more they will either pull away, devalue, and discard. That's why any relationship with a narcissistic person feels like a game of cat and mouse. And alas, our own egos do get in the way as well. Somehow, mastering the narcissist, this idea of mastering the narcissist, finally outplaying and outmaneuvering them, figuring out how they think, getting ahead of them. It is our egos that are often also playing out. We think we can win at this game. This also goes beyond trying to just fix childhood hurts, but rather our adult ego of, I'm a smart person, I can figure this out. Listen, I do this for a living. This work on narcissism is what I do and write about and think about. And when I meet a new person in my life, new person who encounters me and who is narcissistic, I might actually also hang out a minute longer than is good for me to figure it out. But I can tell you one thing, and I gave this up a long time ago. I do not try to master the narcissist. I locate the exits and I get out. I learned long ago that being near these kinds of antagonistic personalities for longer than necessary is not good for me. And my own wounds get triggered by these experiences. And my own wounds also mean that not only is mastering them pointless, because again, I'm really not sure it can be done, maybe for temporary bits of time, maybe, but that's it. It runs the risk of actually making me sick. We can get physically ill. I'm at a point in my life in which suffering fools and narcissistic people just isn't worth it anymore. And if I have to sit in the theater of narcissism, perhaps a little longer than I want to, maybe because I'm in a meeting and I can't get out of that meeting, what I sometimes do is I, at least mentally, try to find the popcorn and watch the narcissistic person's behavior for the theater that it is, and cringe at the fawning of the other people there who still don't get it and don't want to hear it from me. Some of you are saying, but wait a minute, Dr. RAMANI, didn't you once talk about narcissistic fluffing? Isn't fluffing just a form of fawning, of trying to master the narcissist? It's a good question if you're thinking it, but not exactly. And I understand, though, again, I really understand the question, because even I grappled with that for a little while. Fluffing, and for those of you who haven't seen that video, please check it out. Fluffing, for those of you who haven't seen that video, specifically to narcissism, is about complimenting, validating, and making the narcissist feel good. It's intentional. Fluffing is a short-term strategy. It's an intentional strategy. It's really designed to create a little bit of time and space to create a strategy, to distract the narcissistic person with supply so you can figure out your next steps. Maybe that gives you the time you need to find a new job, to get through the holiday dinner without a fight, to avoid their rage, to figure out your next move. Because it is intentional, fluffing is intentional, it's not fawning. Fawning is more of an automatic, almost nervous system response. Fluffing is not a long-term strategy. It will exhaust you, and it will break your spirit, and honestly, it'll lose its potency over time. It's like a spare tire. You can only drive on it for so long. The myth of this idea of mastering a narcissist runs the risk of keeping you in these relationships for too long, driven by a childlike fantasy of winning over that unavailable parent from so many years ago. It can often start with the involuntary fawning that happens when you're triggered, and then it can transform into a determined game in which you keep trying to win this person over, to master them, to figure them out. And it is not good for you, nor is it going to achieve the desired goal. The best way to master a narcissist, quite frankly, in a way that protects you, is to maintain realistic expectations, radical acceptance, and boundaries, and put your mastery energy into healthier, respectful, kind, compassionate, and growth-oriented relationships. With more and more and more people talking about narcissism, especially when it arrives in business situations, people want to know, can I master this? I would say, don't try to master it, try to protect yourself. You can try, but it's a short-term strategy, and ultimately, you will get bit. Thanks again for tuning in.